I'm going to start recording. Welcome to everyone for this third edition of the webinar series. Welcome, Bulus. I'm just going to, if you can just turn your video off as well, please, so just to save bandwidth. Yeah, Jeremy, you can go back on. So this is my a privilege also to welcome our two guests, special guests from America all the way. So it's just amazing to have you also in this room. So Jeremy Schipper and Aisha Jr., they would have been with us in March for the conference. We were very sad when COVID sort of derailed our plans and also the whole world's plans. So we're not alone. But at least we could get something back of the energy also of the conference and of having you also here in our space. And we do hope that it's still some point you still can come and visit our wonderful country as well. And before I formally introduce you, I just want to have a couple of house rules to everyone. So those of you who have been here for the previous 2 weeks know that we sort of use the chat function only after the speakers have sort of completed their presentations. So each of one of them have about 25, 30 minutes. And so they will speak one after the other. And then we have about a half an hour in which you are there. You can post questions and you can, so in the chat box or, by raising your hand, and I will then moderate also the conversation. I also want to invite and welcome the fourth years. So my colleague Dion Foster sort of invited you or asked you, or friendly sort of invited you to be part of this conference. And the reason for that is because in systematic theology, you do also asked to attend a conference as part of your course. And I mean, this is the best sort of substitute, or it's a conference that we can sort of offer you at this point. And also, I'm so glad because I get to teach you also in the Old Testament class, in which we do gender, post-colonial, queer, masculinity, disability studies in reading the Old Testament. So you will be reading both of these colleagues. So it's wonderful for me to show them to you. So for sort of, I've talked about them and sort of you've been also directed to some of their work. And so to see them in flesh or embodied, it's kind of also excited. It makes the words so sort of come alive in that way. So I got to know Jeremy and Aisha at Princeton Theological Seminary, where I studied. They were both a couple of years behind me. I think Jeremy about a year and Aisha 3 years, probably 3 years behind me. And they've since then graduated, but then since then done amazing things. I mean, they are really leaders in their field. It's just such a joy also to read their work and see the interesting things they are doing. So Jeremy Schipper, both of them are teaching at Temple University and just outside of Philadelphia, about 2 hours right outside of Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. Am I right? So yeah. And then
Philadelphia.
It's in Philadelphia. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Why did I? It's in Philadelphia. Okay, I've not been. Sorry. So it's in Philadelphia. That's also where they live, and so they both teach there. Before that, Jeremy's been there for a long time. Nisha came about a couple of years ago. She was before that at Howard University in Washington D.C. Jeremy is a specialist also in disability studies, of reading really groundbreaking work in reading the Hebrew Bible through a disability lens. And Nisha, I'm not sure if she would proclaim herself to be a womanist scholar, but she did write the introduction. No, see, I know that. She did write the introduction to womanist biblical theology, or sort of womanist interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, which I think is a very good sort of introduction. I often use that also for students. But I mean, both of them has written very recently. They actually co-wrote a book also now on the Black Samson. They will also talk about that. But sort of in interpretation history, I think they're reception history, very much interested in that. And then Nisha also recently completed her monograph on reconfiguring and rethinking Hagar. I've also pointed my third years to that in sort of the elective that I'm teaching. So, Jeremy, I might be missing your sort of recent monograph. So you can maybe just also reference that. But I mean, both of them are prolific authors writing a lot. So you definitely will do well to get to know also their work. So Naisha is going to speak first, and after that, Jeremy. So Naisha, I will then now also then just share your screen as well. So. Okay.
Great. All right. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, excellent.
Okay, great. Good. So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection. Thank you again to Dr. Claessens for the invitation. As she mentioned, we originally were scheduled to be with you in person. I had already purchased my guidebook. I already had a list of wineries I was planning to visit. So I'm at least glad that we are able to be with you virtually. So today my talk is on the mark of Cain and white violence. Next slide, please.
But I'm sorry, it's Prof. Claessens, eh?
Oh, Professor Claessens, thank you. In the 2016 film, Moonlight, Juan says, "Let me tell you something, man. There are Black people everywhere. Remember that, okay? No place you can go in the world ain't got no Black people. We was the first on this planet." Next slide. So in our time together, I want to explore the connections that are made between the so-called mark of Cain, white skin, and questions of white violence. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about the mark of Cain and how that connects with white skin and white violence. Next slide. So I know we have some students here. I don't know if you all have some sort of assignment that's due for joining the conference, but I always try to make sure that everything is as clear as possible in case people have some sort of reflection paper or something that's due. So we'll talk about the mark of Cain. We'll talk about the mark of Cain as dark skin, which you probably may be familiar with. The mark of Cain as white skin, and then white skin linked to the killing of Abel. So in order to do that, I will focus largely on the work of Marcus Garvey, but I'll explain all of that as we go, and we'll start with the mark of Cain. Next slide, please. So just some background on Cain and Abel. In the book of Genesis, Cain and Abel are the children of Adam and Eve, and Cain kills his brother Abel in Genesis 4. The text does not offer a specific reason for the killing, but earlier, God accepts Abel's offering, but not Cain's. So Abel is a keeper of sheep, while Cain is a tiller of the ground, basically a farmer. Cain brings an offering of the first of the ground, but Abel brings of the firstlings of his flock. And in Genesis 4, the Lord has regard for Abel and his offering, but does not for Cain and his offering. Later, although the text does not explain how much time elapses, Cain and Abel go into the field, and Cain rises up against Abel and kills him. Again, it doesn't explain explicitly how he does this. Did he come up behind him? Was it a sneak attack? Was it face-to-face? It doesn't explain. But in Genesis 4:9, the Lord asks Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And Cain offers the famous response, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Going on, the Lord says that Abel's brother is crying out, Abel's blood rather is crying out to him from the ground, and the Lord pronounces sentence against Cain and says, Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain says, my punishment is greater than I can bear. And he fears that anyone who meets him may kill him. The Lord then, next slide, please, places a mark on Cain in Genesis chapter 4, verse 15. The purpose of the mark is to prevent anyone who encounters Cain from killing him, but the text does not provide a description of the mark. The use of the term in the Hebrew occurs in many places in the Hebrew Bible and gives us a very wide range of indicators. So the same term, ot, is used for the sign of the covenant after the flood, which is Genesis 9:12. It's also used with circumcision as a sign of the covenant in Genesis 17:11. It's a sign indicating that God has sent Moses in Exodus 4:12. And it's also a sign of the instructions provided by God in Deuteronomy 6:8. And it is a sign of the pledge required by Rahab in Joshua 2:12. So given that kind of range, we don't really have any sense of what the mark actually looks like on Cain. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move to talk about the mark of Cain as dark skin. Next slide. So God places the mark on Cain for Cain's protection. And some interpreters have understood this quote unquote mark of Cain as a curse that darkened the skin of Cain and his descendants. So treating biblical creation narratives as historical, they regarded Adam and Eve as progenitors of all creation, and then used that to support their theory, next slide please, of monogenesis. So monogenesis just means the idea of a single origin for humanity. So again, their focus is trying to think of the biblical text as strictly historical. So these interpreters use Genesis chapter 4, verse 15 to explain the origins of dark-skinned African peoples. Next slide, please. Some interpreters linked this mark of Cain with the so-called curse of Ham in Genesis 9. So just quickly to recap, Ham sees the nakedness of his father Noah and tells his brothers Shem and Japheth. When Noah learns what he has done, he does not actually curse Ham, but rather curses Ham's son Canaan. Anyway, it's still called the curse of Ham. So Noah curses him and consigns him to serve his brothers. So that's in Genesis 9. It is connected with the mark of Cain, but that's really another story for another day. Fundamentally, what you need to know is pro-slavery advocates employed both texts in arguments supporting enslavement. Okay, so that's some background. Many of you were probably already familiar with that, but just to make sure we're all on the same page before we move to some new material. So next slide, please. So now to talk about the mark of Cain as white skin. Next slide. So the mark of Cain as a curse of dark skin is a fairly well-known interpretive tradition. Some Black interpreters, however, regard white people as the descendants of an originally Black Cain. So again, this is different than what we've seen in the past. So this is interpreters arguing that Cain was originally Black, and it is white people who descend from him. Next slide, please. So this is a tradition that holds that Cain turned white with fear after killing Abel, or at least after God confronts him after the death of Abel. Next slide, please. So some white informants report hearing such traditions about an originally dark Cain from African peoples. So, for example, British traveler and prolific writer, so Richard Francis Burton, shared a tale from what he called converted Negroes in West Africa. And he reports, quote, Cain was a black man, but when rebuked by the creator for murder, he turned pale with fear, hence the white color, end quote. So what they're arguing is that Cain was originally dark. Similar accounts were recounted by folklorists and others who were documenting tales from Africans in the US. Next slide, please. One of those is William Pickens. So in 1926, William Pickens was a Black American educator, and he published an account of a black belt preacher who explained the development of the races. So this is using Black American vernacular, and the preacher explains. Brothers and sisters, the first man what the Lord made been named Adam. The first woman been named Eve. They had two childrens, Cain and Abel. The ma and the pa and all them childrens was black, was colored folks. Now Cain was a bad Negro. All his shooting and cutting and gambling. He was jealous of his brother Abel and killed him one day in a spite over the best watermelon in the patch. Then the Lord come up behind Cain and says he, Cain, where am thy brother? That Cain was a sassy Negro, so he don't turn round to see who 'tis, but just answers up biggity, am I my brother's keeper? I ain't got him in my pockets. I suppose he's off somewhere shooting craps. Then the Lord, he spoke more angry like, Cain, where am thy brother? Then that Negro turned round and he see it was the Lord, and he got so scared that his hair stand right up on his face, turned right pale. And sisters and brothers, that am where the first white man come from. Next slide, please. So in Black Culture and Black Consciousness, 1977, historian Lawrence Levine cited several examples of this type of African and African-American folklore that described Cain as the progenitor of white people. Since then, other scholars have also cited Levine's sources. Sometimes they mention Levine even, and have provided additional versions of this story from other 19th and early 20th century sources. Levine and others interpreted such folklore of an originally white Cain as countering well-known understandings of the skin darkening mark of Cain. For example, Levine wrote, quote, the assumption of a black creation allowed slaves to stand the white creation myths on their heads, end quote. Next slide, please. So Levine and other scholars treated the idea of the Cain becomes white tradition as countering ideas of the darkening mark of Cain tradition. So Levine and other historians are reading this primarily as a reaction to or a corrective to anti-Black interpretive traditions regarding the mark of Cain. So they're arguing that this talk of a mark as white skin is really in response to the idea of the mark as dark skin. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll get to the white skin and linking that to killing Abel. Next slide. So I want to focus on Marcus Garvey. He is not alone in this, but just for time's sake, I want to spend some time on him. So I want to talk about how Garvey reframed the idea of the mark of Cain within a Black interpretive tradition that has been overlooked in scholarly discussions of the racialized interpretation of the mark of Cain. So Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican-born Black nationalist who founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1916. He was committed to Pan-Africanism. He was a very charismatic speaker, a political activist, and also a newspaper editor. He is responsible for galvanizing the early 20th century Back to Africa movement. Next slide, please. So material from Garvey and others regarding this Cain becomes white interpretation demonstrates that they are not simply focused on accounting for the color of white people, but rather arguing for Blackness as an original state of humanity. Furthermore, within this strand of tradition, some interpreters push further to explain why, in their view, white people are inherently violent. So unlike Levine and others, these interpreters treat Blackness as natural and understand whiteness as perverse. Next slide, please. I think we skipped one. Yes, thanks. So in a speech delivered on August 1st, 1922, at the 3rd Annual Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World in New York City, Garvey claimed that Cain killed Abel out of envy of his brother's success and a desire for his brother's property. Although his speech does not interpret Abel's murder as part of an origin story of white people, Garvey asserted that European nations exploit Africa in similar ways. So Garvey goes on to explain, from the fall of Adam, man became a rebellious, wicked, covetous yes man. From the time of Cain, and Abel coveted the property of his brother, became envious of his brother's success. It was on the principle of injustice that Cain killed Abel. It is on the same principle of injustice that England exploits Africa, that France exploits Africa, that Italy exploits Africa, that Belgium exploits Africa, that the stronger nations of the world exploit the weak. Next slide, please. In 1927, Garvey wrote The Tragedy of White Injustice while imprisoned in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. In this epic poem, Garvey described the white race as inheriting Cain's blood guilt and emerging from caves to steal the products of civilization developed in Africa. He writes, blood of murderer Cain is on their head, of man and beast they mean to kill dead. Out of cold old Europe these white men came, from caves, dens, and holes without any fame, eating their dead's flesh and sucking their blood, relics of the Mediterranean flood. Literature, science, and art they stole after Africa had measured each pole. So here Garvey is arguing that white people have inherited Cain's murderous tendencies and that they survived with no civilization to speak of in the caves of Europe. Although both the 1922 speech and the 1927 poem associate Cain and white people with bloodshed, neither addresses Cain's encounter with God after he kills Abel. Next slide, please. So in lesson 12 of Garvey's 1938 School of African Philosophy curriculum, Garvey explicitly links Cain's becoming white with fear and the inherent violence of white people. Cain commits the first murder when he kills his brother Abel, and after Cain's encounter with God, he flees to the land of Nod on the east of Eden in Genesis 4:16. So building on these texts, Garvey declares, when Cain slew Abel and God appeared to ask for his brother, he was so shocked that he turned white, being the affliction of leprosy, and as such, he became the progenitor of a new race out of double sin. The white man is Cain transformed, hence his career of murder from Cain to Mussolini. It is evident and fair assumption that when Cain ran away and disappeared from the neighborhood of his parents and journeyed afar, he built up a new race living in the same country but far away. And in the process of time in Africa, where all this happened, the Negro race, through Adam and Eve, continued their multiplication, and as it spread itself in the development of a civilization, it came suddenly upon the settlement of Cain, and knowing Cain's history of blood, ran the entire race from that neighborhood across the Mediterranean into Europe. The white race of Cain hid in caves for centuries, therefore their white skin became fixed, as most of the time they were hidden from the light. Hence, the white man as a European. Although Garvey explains Cain's transformation into a white man as a result of shock and leprosy, he also focuses on how white people have inherited Cain's violence. So in doing so, he provides an origin story for their skin color and geographic location. So for Garvey, whites ended up in Europe because Cain's white descendants were driven out of Africa by the Black descendants of Adam and Eve, who knew of Cain's violence. Here, Garvey credited the Black descendants of Adam and Eve living in Africa with developing civilizations, while the white descendants of Cain hid in caves in Europe. So for Garvey, altogether, white people share in Cain's envy and greed, which he understands as the primary motives for Cain's murder of Abel. Although both the 1922 speech and the 1927 poem associate Cain and the white race with the bloodshed that Garvey noted in 1938, neither the speech nor the poem address Cain's encounter with God. Extant versions of the story of Cain turning white with fear do not emphasize this idea that the white race's propensity for envy and greed as evidence of their connection to Cain. So one cannot account for this aspect of Garvey's version by suggesting that he is simply repeating this folklore that reacts to anti-Black interpretations of the mark of Cain. Rather, Garvey is reframing it within a different understanding of Cain as the progenitor of white people, unrelated to his fearful confrontation with God. Read against this backdrop, his references to Cain reflect a clear understanding of white people as linked to Cain through a shared tendency toward envy, greed, and murder. Nonetheless, scholarly discussions of Cain as the progenitor of the white race tend to cite Garvey's 1938 interpretation without acknowledging his previous discussions of Cain or other writers of African descent. Such scholarship catalogs Garvey's interpretation as simply another example of white with fear readings. Garvey and others were not simply attempting to solely counter anti-Black interpretations of the mark of Cain. Instead, they are arguing that Cain was progenitor of white people and served as the origin point of a long history of white violence. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, because I know frequently you have to write these things up. Bottom line, what am I saying? In his 1963 classic, The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin wrote, "In the same way that we, for white people, were the descendants of Ham and were cursed forever, white people were for us the descendants of Cain." Scholarly discussions on racialized interpretations of the mark of Cain have tended to group together Black interpretations of white Cain. In general, they have not differentiated folklore regarding an originally Black Cain who turns white with fear and treatments of a Cain who is understood as progenitor of white people who are violent like their ancestor. Furthermore, scholars have neglected to acknowledge that neither interpretation is merely a reaction to anti-Black ideologies. Black biblical interpreters have their own concerns and interests and are not solely writing in response to white biblical interpreters. By regarding Black interpretations of white Cain as without tradition or unmoored from other African diasporic traditions, scholars have neglected an important strand of interpretation regarding the mark of Cain. Thank you. Last slide, please. So that is my time, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Skipper. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nasha. I hope everybody can see her 3 books there, and we can also put this back on the end or put in the chat box. I'm going to stop sharing now, but we'll put up that sort of that. And then also, so if you can maybe, sir, if you can just mute your or put your video down. Tokushu, if you can, then we can sort of save bandwidth as well. Thank you so much. Okay. Sorry, can you just maybe switch off your video, Mr. Toshuku? Please just put on your video. Switch off your video. Jeremy, you probably can, yeah, maybe just, yeah, continue. So thank you. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, very good. Thank you so much, Jeremy. So.
All right. So good afternoon. So the title of my talk this afternoon is I Am Black, My Beloved is White. And that title combines 2 different verses from the Song of Songs, sometimes called the Song of Solomon. And in the King James Version, it translates the woman's declaration in Song 1:5 as, I am black but comely. This statement is among the best known and most contested lines in the book. Scholars have devoted much less attention, however, to her declaration in 5:10, which the King James Version translates as, my beloved is white and ruddy. So the title of my talk combines those 2 lines, I am black from 1:5 and I am white, my beloved is white from 5:10. My talk this afternoon is about how some 19th century African-American interpreters linked these 2 verses and interpreted them in relation to interracial relationships in the United States. When I was first invited to deliver this paper for the conference in March, which, as we mentioned before, it was canceled because of the COVID crisis, I had intended to survey a number of these interpretations. But because we have a shorter amount of time in the online format, I think it's best to limit my discussion today to 1 example and offer more in-depth analysis of that example. So I'm going to talk today about an obscure article from 1860 titled Amalgamation Among the Ancients. This article, whose author is unknown, argued in favor of interracial relationships based on 4 examples from the Hebrew Bible, namely the marriages of Joseph, Moses, Solomon, and Jeroboam. While Joseph, Moses, and Jeroboam are mentioned very briefly, the article focuses primarily on one of Solomon's many marriages. The author argued that Solomon was involved in an interracial relationship because, again, according to King James Version, which was a dominant English version at the time, Song 5:1 describes the woman as black, and Song 5:10 describes her male lover as white. So the author interpreted these descriptions according to modern constructions of race in the United States. The article was published on March 1st, 1860 in the Anglo-African magazine. At the time, this magazine, which is based in New York, was unique among American periodicals in that it only published works by authors of Black African descent. This means that although we don't know who the author was, we do know that she or he was Black. Also, to provide some context, when this article was published, slavery was still legal in the United States. It was also published over 100 years before the United States Supreme Court declared in 1967 that prohibitions against interracial marriages were illegal. In other words, it would be considered quite progressive to make a biblical case for interracial relationships in the United States in 1860. Nevertheless, the article begins with the bold declaration that, quote, "It is a very remarkable fact that the most eminent men of ancient history married Black women," end quote. The author begins by noting Joseph's marriage to an Egyptian woman in Genesis 41, and Moses' marriage to a Cushite, or following the King James Version, an Ethiopian woman in Numbers 12. After that, the author focuses the rest of the article on Solomon's marriage to an unnamed Egyptian princess, mentioned in 1 Kings 3:1. Following the tradition that Solomon wrote the Song of Songs, the author believed that the man and the woman in the Song of Songs were Solomon and his Egyptian bride. The author used Song 1:5 and 5:10 to provide different racial identifications for Solomon and the Egyptian princess. The author states, quote, "It has been said by those who have never carefully read the Song of Solomon that he was a Black man. But no person who reads that book properly can say so. That King Solomon is a white man is as certain as it is that his royal queen was a Black woman. For his queen, when speaking for him in the Song of Solomon, says, 'My beloved is white and ruddy.' And again, when speaking for herself, she says, 'I am Black, but comely,'" end quote. To be clear, this author was not the first person to interpret the Song of Solomon as referring to Solomon's marriage to his unnamed Egyptian wife, or to interpret her as Black based on Psalm 1:5. As far back as the 1600s, for example, the British theologian Matthew Poole claimed that Psalm 1:5, quote, "alludes to the complexion of Pharaoh's daughter, who was Black," end quote. So the author of Amalgamation Among the Ancients was not unique in claiming that Solomon married a Black Egyptian woman. Yet, what separated this article from previous interpretations was the author's insistence that Solomon married his Black wife because he genuinely loved her. The author states explicitly that, quote, "King Solomon married the princess because he loved her. He loved her not only for her beauty, but for her wisdom and intelligence," end quote. For this author, love provided the motivation for Solomon's marriage to this Black Egyptian woman. By contrast, many biblical scholars today interpret the marriage of Solomon and Pharaoh's daughter as a political arrangement that aligned the Egyptian and Israelite kings. While there is much to commend this interpretation, some pro-slavery interpreters in the 19th century used this idea to argue that this was a marriage only of political necessity, and that Solomon could not have actually loved a Black woman. For example, in 1852, John Fletcher published an influential pro-slavery book titled Studies on Slavery, which interpreted numerous biblical passages as justifications for slavery in the United States. He assumed that Solomon was white, but grudgingly acknowledged that the woman mentioned in Psalm 1:5 was Black. A problem for Fletcher was that he thought interracial relationships were a perversion. He declared, quote, "Cohabitation with the Blacks on the part of the whites is a great sin and is proof of a great moral debasement, end quote. Yet he defended Solomon's relationship as, quote, one of state policy on the part of Solomon, end quote. To support this justification, Fletcher cited Song 6:13, that's 7:1 in Hebrew, and in this verse, the woman asks Solomon what he sees in her, and the king replies, quote, the company of two armies, and that's the King James Version, the company of two armies, end quote. In other words, according to Fletcher, these verses show that Solomon's interracial marriage was simply a political act done only to strengthen Solomon's empire by bringing together the Israelite and Egyptian armies through marriage. For Fletcher, the marriage did not involve any romantic feelings because Solomon surely could not have loved a black woman. It was just politics. So when read within the context of mid-19th century works like Fletcher's, the idea in Amalgamation Among the Ancients that Solomon married a black woman for love stands out as a radical claim. It is more than just a sweet, sentimental interpretation of the Song of Songs. It contrasts sharply with the idea that there was nothing more to Solomon's marriage than statecraft. In fact, while Fletcher cited Song 6:13 to support his argument that the marriage was a loveless political arrangement, the author of Amalgamation Among the Ancients quotes verses from the very same chapter to show that Solomon thought his black wife was beautiful. These verses that the author quotes from the King James Version read, O thou fairest among women, and that's 6:1. The daughters saw her and blessed her, yea, the queens and the concubines, and they praised her. That's Song 6:9. And she that looketh forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun. That's Song 6:10. So the author of Amalgamation Among the Ancients used all these verses from chapter 6 to argue that Solomon found her very beautiful. And so it wasn't just a loveless political marriage. The author also insisted that Solomon's interracial marriage was a passionate relationship based on more than physical attraction. The author continues, quote, Solomon loved her not only for her beauty, but for her wisdom and intelligence. He was a great lover of wisdom. He says, wisdom is the principal thing, end quote. The line, wisdom is a principal thing, comes from Proverbs 4:7. The author presumably claims that Solomon said this because most of the book of Proverbs has been traditionally attributed to Solomon, and that was certainly true in 1860. The idea that Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs may explain why the author connects a reference to honey in Song 4:11 to wisdom. The author writes, quote, speaking of her wisdom and intelligence, Solomon says, thy lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb. Honey and milk are under thy tongue, end quote. The author interprets the reference to honey in the woman's mouth as Solomon's praise for his black wife's intelligence and wise words, because the author seems to know that the book of Proverbs associates wisdom with honey. For example, Proverbs 24:13-14 reads, quote, eat thou honey, because it is good, and the honeycomb, which is sweet to thy taste. So shall the knowledge of wisdom be unto thy soul. End quote. If Solomon wrote both Song of Songs and Proverbs, as the author implies, as the author reasoned, then the reference to honey in Song 4:11 refers to Solomon's praise of his black wife's intellect. Finally, the author pointed out that according to 1 Kings 7:8 and 9:24, quote, Solomon built a palace expressly for this beautiful woman. The author implies that this building of the palace was the expression of his deep love and affection for her. So, having shown that Solomon loved her for her beauty and her intelligence, the author asks rhetorically, quote, should the world think any less of Solomon because he loved and married a black woman? End quote. The author asserts that Solomon was a, quote, great, wise, and virtuous man, a God-fearing and God-loving man, and yet he respected, honored, and loved a black woman enough to marry her. End quote. As with the Song of Solomon and Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes was commonly attributed to Solomon in the author's days. This may explain why the author includes a line from Ecclesiastes 1:9, there is not a new thing under the sun, in the conclusion of his article. The author writes, quote, amalgamation, then, is not a new thing under the sun. It is an established fact that white men have loved black women even as far back as the days of Solomon. They continue to love black women just as much as ever, but they do not honor or respect them so much. End quote. Here, the author reveals a central point of the article. White men in the author's time still love black women, but in the author's opinion, they no longer respect or honor them as Solomon did. In the 19th century America, sexual relationships between white men and black women often involved force or coercion rather than consent for free will. Love can take many forms, the author hints, including unhealthy and abusive forms that do not involve respect or honor because of white supremacy. Several years later, amalgamation among the ancients was quoted in other local newspapers around the United States. For example, on Friday, March 30th, 1877, the Harrisburg Telegraph, a local paper in the state of Pennsylvania, published parts of amalgamation among the ancients under the headline, Color in Matrimony. Arguing in favor of interracial marriage, this article edited the earlier one down to just a couple of sentences each about Joseph, Moses, Solomon, and Jeroboam. It only retained a few sentences about Solomon from the longer version of him in the earlier article. These sentences, however, do not mention that Solomon loved his black wife or that he respected her intellectually. They only mention that he married her and he thought she was beautiful. They read, quote, King Solomon married a black woman, an Egyptian princess. His royal queen was one of the most beautiful women of her time. The king, in speaking of her beauty, describes her as she that looketh forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, end quote. And again, that biblical quotation is from Song 610 in the King James Version. Over the following weeks and months, this abbreviated discussion of Solomon and the other biblical figures was reprinted verbatim in local newspapers elsewhere in the United States, specifically in the states of Massachusetts, Missouri, and Kansas. So the argument in amalgamation among the ancients that the marriages of Joseph, Moses, Solomon, and Jeroboam were examples of interracial relationships, that argument spread in the decades following its publication in 1860. Yet, again, we should notice that this later edited version leaves out any mention that Solomon loved, respected, or honored the black woman who he married. This contrasts sharply with what we found in amalgamation among the ancients. In that article, the point is not just to document several examples of interracial relationships in the Hebrew Bible. Instead, the point was to emphasize the nature of Solomon's love for his black wife. It is not just a matter of the quantity of prominent interracial relationships in the Bible, Joseph, Moses, Solomon, and Jeroboam. It is a matter of the quality of the love in these interracial relationships. This would be especially important, again, in the 19th century America, when, as the author implies, white supremacy meant that white women had little respect for their black lovers. To conclude, I have focused on one example of how the Hebrew Bible was used to address interracial relationships in 19th century America, and there are many, many others. Of course, how you interpret Solomon's marriage depends in part on which biblical text you prioritize, which text you downplay or ignore, and which text you link together to make your case. If you prioritize the narrator's negative evaluation in 1 Kings 11 of Solomon's hundreds of wives, including Egyptian ones, you may question whether Solomon's love for these women involved much love or respect. Solomon's love for these women involved much respect or honor. You could link this evaluation to 2 Chronicles 8:11, where the narrator claims that Solomon built a house for his Egyptian wife because he did not want her to live in the city of David, which was holy. Using these texts, you could construct a profile of their marriage that had nothing to do with love, respect, or affection. Yet, rather than focusing on these texts, the author of Amalgamation Among the Ancients focuses on texts from the Song of Songs and Proverbs. Working under the assumption that Solomon wrote these texts, the author prioritizes what she or he believed to be Solomon's first-person account of his relationship with the black woman over that of a judgmental biblical narrator in 1 Kings. When Solomon speaks for himself, the author suggests, his deep love and thorough respect for a black woman shines through. For this particular author, the marriage between Solomon and the Egyptian woman becomes a model for interracial marriage between black and white people of his or her day. Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you so much. Nisha, also if you can join and put your video on. Thank you so much to both of you. This has been wonderful. I really enjoyed so much listening to both of you. I think it fits so well in also with sort of the theme also of the conference, also thinking, you know, of othering or how we goes through the other, but also just with the interpretation history, sort of bringing up new perspectives also in the text, and yeah, sort of asking the questions of what our interpretation does, you know, and this is something definitely our students are thinking about in the 4th year classes, in Old Testament, I know, also with my colleague in systematic theology. So I already have some questions here. Paul, we did not ignore you. We were just sort of having the speakers speak to complete their paper. So Paul, so you can see this in the chat function, if you can see there. My questions are related to Nisha's presentation. Is there any record of the descendants of Cain even after the flood? Is there any statistics which are more violent than Moses? So you have a number of questions there. Moses, Sign, or Malcolm, different complexion. So I have that. And then Falola, my colleague, Lola Oloyede, she was also a postdoc in our gender unit, still research in the gender unit. And she's written, I thought of you, Lola, because you wrote also an essay on Miriam and Moses, and sort of, yeah, sort of very interesting, and Moses' marriage also to that. So maybe for Lola, I will also ask, have you asked that question? And then we'll give the presenters time to respond to these 2 questions, and then if there's some others as well. Lola, you're welcome to switch on your video or not, or yeah. So.
Yeah, I want to thank both of you, Yasha and Jeremy, for the papers. They sync very well. But my question is to Jeremy. I know you have a short time and you were focusing on only one illustration,
Yes.
but what kept resounding through that paper was this idea of a white man marrying a black woman. Yes. And then it's kind of suggestive of this idea of marrying down. You know, you talk about people marrying up and marrying down. You know, like for a white man to marry a black woman, you're kind of marrying down, or the black woman is marrying up. But I didn't hear anything about a black man marrying a white woman. Would this be too much, you know? It would be condescending, too low, or if it's marrying up or marrying down. I
Yeah,
want
so
to see what your focus is.
oh yeah, so that's a
Whether
great.
what you have said apply the other way around.
Yes, so that's a great question. And there is a couple of things that in the article the author says that should we think any less of Solomon because he married a black woman, and so the author is sort of getting at the idea of don't think of Solomon as condescending to marry this black woman. Another part of the article that I didn't get a chance to talk about was at the very tail end. The article, the author has a couple of lines talking about, well, what about the reverse? What if a black man tried to marry a white woman in the U.S.? And he says that's he compares that to the Shakespearean play Othello, and he says that the culture is so dangerous in the U.S. and so anti-black in the U.S. that if you consider the reverse, if you consider a black man marrying or trying to marry or even showing any kind of interest in a black woman, that he says that person would get many raps to his head. That's the words he used, meaning the guy would be in serious physical danger. So he acknowledges that. You do get an interesting other example, actually, in the work of a woman named Ida B. Wells, who in the late 19th century was campaigning against the lynching of African Americans. And she points to Song of Song 1:5 and says that the line "black but comely" can only be spoken by a white man, because if a white woman said "black but comely" in describing a black man, she would be in trouble. And if even if a black woman, even a black man said about a black woman, she's black but comely, he would be in trouble too. So basically, she was saying that the only person who can express that line is a white man, and she was protesting that. So you do get other considerations to your question. You do get other considerations of what happens if you have the reverse, and almost across the board, when that scenario is considered, it's emphasized that that is a severe danger. Most likely, a black man who showed interest in a white woman at the time would probably be lynched.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's a very helpful also response. And Nisha, you've disappeared. But there's two questions now for you. If you can go back. So also Gary Snyman. So he's written quite a bit on Cain and the mark of Cain, and also from whiteness and the outsider. So I think it's a very interesting. I think you would have some interesting conversation also. So if you can maybe to both those questions, if you can see those questions in the chat room. So
yes.
Okay.
So first question appears to be more historical. So I'm not treating these texts as historical. So there's not a question about arguing over which race is more violent. In terms of Moses, actually, Dr. Skipper and I have written on Moses and disability. So you might want to check that out. But there is a question of Moses, not so much white, black, or colored, but questions of how much Moses identifies with Egyptians and how much he identifies with the Israelites. So that's a somewhat related but different way of framing the question. In terms of disgust and perversity, and the link between the racial portrayals and the authors of the portrayals. Is this a reaction of preserving their own moral and spiritual identity? I think for Garvey, this is largely a political issue. So the concern here is about white men particularly having power, and I don't think he would argue that this is about spirituality, but rather about political power.
I was also thinking of this notion of just the identity construction, the sort of the othering, which works also the other way around. I mean, it was very interesting. Of course, us in South Africa, we are a really, so Desmond Tutu would always say the rainbow people of God, sort of a melting, sort of so many different cultures, also language groups living next to one another, and also so it's very interesting. Even my class, I mean, sort of just some of my Zulu and Xhosa students would say, I mean, they look so similar, or they are, very much they speak in language sort of related, but there's also very much identity constructions and stereotypes going back and forth between even that two groups that are people would consider both Black, but sort of, have very different also cultural and sort of groups as well. So I think even in terms of what we would call sort of the Cape colored, which is sort of, you would call mixed race, which is not a very nice term here, but sort of, how do you construct who you are? I mean, I see my one colleague here, one of our PhD students, Ashwin, he will always say, I love it, he says he is culturally colored, ontologically Black, spiritually Christian. Do I have that right, Ashwin? In any case, you can also say, but I mean, sort of interesting how identity construction work also in our community and how that works. I see some other questions. Paul, your hand is up. Was it for a previous time, or maybe I will first give somebody else also a chance to ask a question? Other of the colleagues, maybe some of the students, also who's here, some of the other colleagues.
Maybe I could say something in relation to Paul's follow-up there. So about the question was looking at the connection between Cain and the white race, not necessarily historical lineage. This might help, but the several African American intellectuals in the 19th century pointed out, as you seem to imply, that Noah and his family are descendants of Shem, not of Cain. So they argued against the idea that that Black folks are descendants of Cain, because they said, all of Cain's descendants died in the flood, so it would be preposterous to try to link us to Cain. So that was one. It's not necessarily a historical lineage, but that was one of the responses. They said, well, if you're going to say that we're descendants of Cain, well, all of Cain's descendants were killed in the flood, so that's actually not a connection between people of African descent and Cain.
But I think what Jeremy, the point you're also making here is also to say, I mean, this is not, again, what Nigel said is not a historical argument. I mean, this is also how people interpret it, and I mean, sort of, in different communities interpreting in different ways. And I mean, I was even thinking your conversation or sort of about authorship. I mean, the students will know when in the third year we do lyrical literature. I mean, it takes a lot to say, okay, Solomon did not write the Song of Songs, just as much as this, David didn't write the Psalms, but it was dedicated, sort of the notion also of authorship and what the biblical text present as the author, but also how then in terms of a 19th century interpreters who would assume that Solomon is the author.
Yes.
So all the students here he's not countering what I'm saying, but he's saying that, so it's in terms of that community, that is how they sort of perceived it to be, and which is also fascinating. I thought it very interesting, in that interpretation. I mean, they're sort of portraying Solomon's love and loving, relationship, over against maybe in a king's or house portrayed. So that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that's why I kept on trying to qualify the paper. According to this author, Solomon. Yes. Said this, or that kind of thing. Yeah,
I just know my students, they were like, see, it is Solomon who's the author. I told you.
Yeah, I should also mention as a follow-up, part of the reason I kept on quoting the King James Version rather than say my own translation was because the author again was using the King James Version. And with Song 510, most 20th and 21st century translations and scholarly commentaries will translate 5:10 not as my beloved is white and ruddy, but rather my beloved is radiant and ruddy, or my beloved is bright and ruddy. So they kind of moved away from the word white to translate that Hebrew verb. So if you look at, if you read in your Bible, in almost any translation in the last 75 to 100 years, you won't find the description, my beloved is white and ruddy, or rather, my beloved is radiant and ruddy.
No, and I think this is a great example of how translations sort of have effect. You know, my Greek professor always said, "Et traditore." You know, a translator is a traitor. And, you know, but how those translations, how they function and, you know, have also political and ethical consequences. I see there's a question, Kennedy. So that's just an observation, maybe. Oh, this is to Naisha. Yes, do Garvey and company show knowledge of other people groups? I mean, their polemics, or what would they classify as in your writings, post-colonial reading or Black theology or liberation theology? Yes, and then to Jeremy after that, also, thank you, Kennedy, to do you consider Abishag in David's later concubine as a possible maiden in the text? If yes, yeah. So if you apply that David had a Black woman as a concubine and other implications. So yeah, again, you know, so yeah, so hear what you have to say of that. So Naisha and Jeremy.
Yes, Garvey and others are aware of other peoples, but at the time of their writing, they're focused primarily, again, on this concern with those who are in power. So they do tend to frame it primarily as white, Black, but Black is here expansive. So they're aware of other peoples, but they're focusing on white power structures. And that's why it tends to be white, Black without acknowledging other peoples usually.
Jeremy, maybe any thoughts on Abishag?
Sure. So that's a reference to 1 Kings chapter 1. So the idea that in David's old age, it depends on what connotations one has with the word maiden, but that he was given this maiden, and she was used for warmth, to warm him because he was old. But the narrator goes out of the narrator's way to say that he did not have sexual relations with her. Now, whether that implies that she was a Black woman, I'm not sure that the same issues of, say, race or class would have constructed race or class the same way in a time when that passage from 1 Kings 1 was written as we might today. So I'm not sure if a concubine would necessarily suggest that she was a Black woman. We can probably say for sure that if there is a kernel of historicity behind this account, that she probably wasn't at all a white woman. Neither was David a white woman, neither was Solomon a white woman, neither were any of these folks a white women. But they probably, the idea of the connection between race and class, between Black and concubine, that might be something that they maybe would not have constructed it the same way in that particular text. If that gets answered.
However, it might be read in that way, because I know Wilda Gaffney, I mean, she reads Bella and Zilpah very much through a lens of race and class, when she looks at, Maidens.
I would probably take her interpretation there with a grain of salt. Yeah.
No, and I think it's a good reminder. I mean, even just how we think about ethnicity, about race, about class. I mean, it's the same thing as when we think about gender. You know, there's also, we are introducing modern concepts and constructions into sort of ancient text in terms of that. And so the students are very good to know also that they have to read that also critically. So
yes.
Stefan Fischer from all the way from Germany, right? So to add to the recent discussion on translation, yes, I want to add that some study. Oh, you can read that. So maybe if you can see that.
Yeah. So that's so the in Song of Songs, the Shulamite is mentioned. That particular word is mentioned towards the end of chapter 6, beginning of chapter 7, depending on whether Hebrew or English. Absolutely, there's a who in the reception history in the Septuagint has been changed from a dark-skinned ruler woman into a white, radiant semi-goddess. Absolutely, and there's a lot of the history of interpretation or reception history of Song of Songs is so rich and so multifaceted. There's an interesting book recently by I just like on her name, Israeli scholar Pedris, and she wrote a book last year called Song of Songs, a biography, which gives an overview of the history of interpretation. But absolutely, there's a lot of play with race and class in the Song of Songs. Absolutely.
Good. I also just want to pick up on Ashwin, who said that I did sort of identify him correctly. But I mean, he also mentioned in terms of why I think your presentations, I mean, really striking a chord, you know, with many of us. I mean, it's because in terms of what you experience in Black Lives Matter, but which is very much resonated in our country as well, you know, as there's still such a, sort of the divide between rich and poor is still, you know, sort of shocking, and is even, you know, with COVID becoming even more pronounced. So I think, we are having these conversations all the time, also around our campuses. And many of the students are also involved with that in our classes. We are having that. So thank you so much for also sharing, bringing that to us. Let me just see. Paul has another question there. Or that's just a comment, maybe. So that's maybe just a comment. Let me just see if there are others, people from the floor who want to just raise your voice or speak or something, if you want to say.
I could comment on Paul's. Paul mentioned the Talmud called Nimrod a Cushite. Could that be that he was a black man? If so, then racial. Okay, yeah. So this is a very interesting question. So Cush was, according to the Table of Nations in Genesis 11, Cush was the son, or Nimrod, I should say, was the son of Cush. So he's a Cushite in the sense that he comes from a Cush, who was Ham's son, and Ham was the son of Noah. And there was absolutely a lot of interpretation. History of interpretation of the Cushites as black, racially black. That was especially gained a lot of traction in the early 19th century to talk about Nimrod as a great builder of civilization, and that Cush, the Cushites were great builders of civilization. In part, that was to counter some racist interpretations which questioned whether black folks were even descendants of Adam or Noah. So a lot of interpreters in the 19th century pointed to Genesis 10, I should say, not 11, Genesis 10, and say that in fact Nimrod as a mighty warrior, and Cush, they were actually they were descendants of Noah and then therefore descendants of Adam and Eve, and therefore then they were fully human and were very accomplished people. So that was to it, in some ways that emphasis on Cush was also to counter racist interpretations which questioned the humanity of people of African descent.
Very interesting, very helpful. So in the chat room, I also see, oh goodness, who was that? Danukola, who said, make the point, I think that's a very good point also that, a mixed marriage or racial intermarriage, it's such a sign also of courage. You're looking at the other. I think in our own country, which we share also with you, the history, it was a crime. Trevor Noah was one of our famous explorers who said, his biography is born a crime. And he speaks also about that, being sort of have a Swiss father and a black mother, and also that. But so I think that we have many examples also of that. Thank you, Naisha, also sharing, some of your publications. I think it's very helpful for the students and also, and from guests who got to know you. Gary, I told you, Gary has written on Cain as perpetrator, and also writing it also from a position of sort of white, white guilt, thinking of is there hope or redemption for us as Afrikaner, whites, what we have done? So reading from that hermeneutical position, is there any redemption for Cain? So maybe, I would love to hear also your thoughts also on that, and sort of engaging with Harry on that. Naisha, that's probably more directed to you. So
Yes. So you're right. Cain is exiled from the community, but he is still offered protection. He exits the scene. You mentioned the same happens with Judas. We also know with Judas, then he kills himself. So these are in some ways similar, but still very different, because Cain is offered this protection by God. So in terms of redemption, he at least offers, I think for some people, the idea that it doesn't have to be death penalty. But my concern is less with the redemption of Cain and dealing more with the brothers and their relationship, and how one understands then the move to be very concerned about Cain, because Abel is the one who is dead. So in the US, this question usually comes up a lot after someone has killed a Black person, but do you forgive them? And I think more often than not, it's really usually a manipulative ploy rather than a real concern with forgiveness. And one of the questions that's raised is, before we get to forgiveness, can we deal with honesty and talking about what actually happened, and a change of heart? So has there been a clear indication that this is what has happened, to tell the truth about the situation before we jump to, is the aggrieved party willing to forgive the party who won't even acknowledge what they've done wrong?
There you connect very much with some of the conversations we are having. Some of our students will tell you also, if they can speak, and you are allowed to speak, students, but about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how a lot of people hold that up, and this is wonderful, and this is another of our great exports to the rest of the world. But how many of our students feel, but that was a sellout, that people did not say really that they are truly sorry, that they continue to just live their ways, sort of in terms of the economic, of one of our political parties is the economic freedom fighters, who say, we haven't had sort of in terms of Black empowerment, we haven't had economic freedom. And I mean, the same, as I'm speaking about my country, I mean, I know you will resonate very much also because that's exactly at the heart of Black Lives Matter. I mean, I think at this point, I mean, I think you are in a much more vulnerable situation. I mean, we really sort of in solidarity also what's happening in this last couple of years, months and years, which has been very difficult, I know. And we do hope for a change of government. But in any case, so others maybe who has, I think I got all the comments there, sort of questions. Is there anybody who has, Ashwin, I knew, thank you, Ashwin.
Hi, Prof. Thank you so much, Naisha. It's been such a joy, such a delight to listen to you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. You should actually show you if you want to show your video, if you can, but they can also see you. So it's my doctor. Okay.
I would just like to comment and perhaps raise a few promptings. What I particularly love about both presentations is the return to previous historical sources, cultural texts that really sort of ask critical questions at the time they were produced that are helpful to return to. And I say that now, mindful of the TRC and its developments in South Africa. I think sometimes those of us who tend to be more radical, we're too critical. We're critical in a way that is unhelpful for the progress that is to be made. And so I think that returning to those cultural texts, that is what these presentations have helped me with now. By returning to those cultural texts that were very against the grain at the time they were produced, it offers a very interesting lens through which to read the present. So for that, I'm particularly grateful. So thank you for holding this space in such a way that has prompted some very interesting reflections.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ashwin, also for sharing and that. Jeremy and Naisha, if you wondered how, I mean, you're speaking in a space that you don't know, hopefully you now feel even more sort of inclined to come over to this side and to see some of these very interesting people in person. But hopefully
speaking for myself, I think it's very much like that. In response to the previous comment, I might also say that yes, going back to the well of the massive reserve of previous texts in conversation. That's, I think, something, if you excuse a shameless plug, that's, I think, something that that both Dr. Junior, Naisha, and I were really excited about with our Black Samson book, was how the figure of Samson, over the last, at least in U.S. history, from the early 19th century to the present, provides a wealth of reflection on some of the critical issues that we in the U.S. are facing today.
Good. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, excellent. So I really would encourage all of you to go check that out. I see another hand. Is there another hand that I'm missing? I'm sort of trying to see that. I can't quite see here in my feed. Oh, sort of go. Anybody who wants to sort of, you can put on your mic and just say if you have another question or type it. So good. Any last chance? So otherwise, I think I'm gonna sort of close this. There's actually a SPL session going on right now on Black Lives Matter. So some of us are gonna switch over to that in America. But thank you so much. So Naita, maybe you can just show your face again for sort of, can see you. And just to say thank you so much to both of you. It was wonderful. Yeah, I think you really blessed us with your presentations and also the great discussion. And thank you to all of you who were here. Next week is my colleague Alfonso, I think, and Harry, if I have it right. If I have it, I think you are presenting next week. So colleagues from the north. Harry also and then Alfonso, who is my colleague also teaching prophets at the University of Pretoria. So we look forward to the rest of you also signing in for that, and then this will be made available. We have a YouTube video that we will make, and sort of you can email Estelle to if you want a copy of that. It will also be on the Facebook page of the Faculty of Theology, and Dion also put that in the feed. So, but thank you so much. I'll be stopping now the recording, but you are welcome to stay around also a bit longer.